So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum. As you can see, tonight we have quite a few guests. Some people were wondering if Moro would make it or not. Moro will make it. Here we are. And he's hanging in there as long as the connection holds, because obviously he's always on the move. So, the connection, that depends on the places. So, a lot. Thanks to Eduardo and Daniele for being here. Let's get started right away. Let's take advantage while Daniele's connection is good. Then soon Generali, Capitini, Giorgio, and Arfaras will join us too. We were just discussing this news in the waiting room with Fontana. The Gulf states are removing the restrictions they imposed just a day earlier. So, this signal could be interpreted as an attempt 24 hours ago to pull out of a renewed American push. And now, maybe under coercion, a return to openness, because without that openness, let's say, it wouldn't be possible to carry out the operations that perhaps Trump would like to resume. News from just an hour ago, so it's very fresh. The other news will also be discussed in depth, along with all the satellite images, including the large ones. A very interesting article came out in the Washington Post where basically through satellite images, it is clear that Iran hit many more US military assets than reported. So much so that there is censorship imposed by the US government on two companies that provide satellite images, even commercial ones. There is a request for it. Not exactly to censor them, but to delay them until after the conflict, let's say to publish them later. And this shows that, in short, they have suffered much more damage than what they have declared. And this is clear from all the satellite images. If you go to the article, you'll find all the references. In fact, there is even more damage than what even the Iranians were claiming. That's what the article says, which is also interesting after all. And this says a lot about the costs of this war. A couple of days ago, I was also looking at the cost, which had exceeded 200 billion, including both damages and operational costs. Here we go. Giorgio has just arrived as well. So, in America, since Trump keeps saying that they destroyed Marina, that they did whatever they wanted. And then every day he declares the opening of the strait, but that's not how it is. And it's clear that the negotiations going through Pakistan may also have China behind them. We'll talk about it because it's quite peculiar, isn't it, that they're happening there. How is the American public experiencing this constant back and forth from Trump? I've watched the biggest, let's say, American shows, even the somewhat satirical ones. And all of them, obviously, are extremely sarcastic. About Trump, they keep making comments. We won every moment. We're close to connecting. The public believes it. There's a debate in America about this thing. Do they realize that it has become a deadlock? Please, Daniele. Listen, please. Daniele, can you hear me? All right. Can't you hear Daniele? Daniele? President.
Now I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Perfect. I turned off the video because there's very little signal. I'm in Paris. Tomorrow is a national holiday because, unlike in Moscow, in Western Europe, we celebrate May 8th, the end of World War II in Europe. So my impression, even looking at the news you just highlighted, is that Trump, even according to some Republicans in Congress, has gotten himself into a situation that he actually can't get out of. In the sense that everyone who follows your channel will remember that in 2015, Obama reached a compromise, like all compromises, with limits and advantages. As soon as Trump was elected, he blew up that compromise. And basically, the impression in Washington is that Trump has boxed himself into going back exactly to the compromise that Obama had found, if not worse. We all know that the regime, contrary to what Trump and also Netanyahu had said, did not fall. The regime did not fall. The regime has become more radicalized, regardless of what Trump says, who destroyed their navy and so on. Even Rubio, you heard him the other day at the press conference, says that we sank them. Actually, it takes little more than a slingshot to shut the Strait of Hormuz, whatever the markets are doing. Across the board, they can't trust the compromise. There's another element that all of Washington is actually starting to think about, because there are very few days left now. Two things. The first thing is that Trump, after postponing it, now has to go to Beijing and find a form of compromise with the Chinese. The Chinese have pushed the Iranians to find at least a minimal truce, something vague. The Chinese are actually helping themselves, but also Trump, to find a way out of a crazy mess that he and Netanyahu have gotten themselves into. The other thing that Italian media I see are not talking about, but it's very important, is that in a few days there will be an actual change in the leadership of the Federal Reserve. This is the other point that puts Trump in a difficult position. Why? You will remember that during the election campaign, he launched a huge attack on Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, the governor, saying that he must lower the rates. Because I have the midterm elections and I need to lower borrowing costs for American voters. Not only will the change happen in a few days, but it's increasingly clear that even the new direction, a requirement of the Fed, won't be able to lower the rates. Obviously, but those who follow your channel know very well the price of gasoline has practically doubled. I remember that during the election campaign, he said he would cut it in half. Not only did he not cut it in half, but in some parts of the United States, where it's historically more expensive, for example, in California, someone posted screenshots showing €6 per gallon. Keep in mind that the goal was to bring it down to just over $2.6 per gallon, to bring it down to just over $2 per gallon. One last thing. There's a situation I'd like to point out to you, even within Israeli public opinion, even among, let me use the term, the center right. So even among those who generally support Netanyahu and his government during election campaigns, who are starting to ask themselves the same questions. They're asking these questions in Washington too. That is, did we get involved to bring about regime change? And regime change hasn't happened. Iran is still there. Tehran is only a 2-hour flight from Tel Aviv. The missile facility, which is what really worries people the most, according to American intelligence, has been cut in half, but still the situation is not resolved. And Lebanon. Lebanon risks becoming another endless story like Gaza. In Gaza, you saw that Hamas, even this morning, confirmed that it does not intend to hand over its weapons and continues to govern much of the Strip. Hezbollah is taking heavy hits, but in reality, they also continue to inflict damage on the Israelis. So you have a situation in which Trump, and I would stress Netanyahu too, are in a situation they got themselves into and can't get out of anymore. Someone, as you've seen, has made the comparison. Putin, who was supposed to go to Kyiv and bring everything home in 3 days. Well, Trump and Netanyahu have gotten themselves into a situation where they risk finding themselves in the same position. Anyway, no matter how hard you try to get a truce, there's always the risk that at any moment someone might start blocking things again. There's one last thing, you've seen it too. There's a lot of criticism from many Gulf countries towards Trump's policies. Here there's a divergence because it's due to conflicting interests that are tied both to the geostrategic position and to the fact that the Gulf economies haven't been protected by the Americans, by American bases, or even by American policy. The worst thing is to start a war and not win it. Basically, Trump, who doesn't even have the courage to call it a war, because otherwise he would have to admit that he has exceeded the legal limit of the famous 60-day war period. You mentioned it too. Actually, he talks about a special operation, something that even the American media are starting to say. I've already heard about a special operation, the one that on the 9th Putin can't celebrate because drones arrive in Red Square. That's all.
What Pesco says that they don't celebrate it using the excuse of Ukrainian terrorism seems like a load of nonsense to me. I don't think the Ukrainians would ever strike Red Square during that moment. The truth is that organizing that parade is quite an effort, and they probably don't want to go through with it, so they're using another excuse. While you were talking in the background with Eduardo, we were watching some breaking news coming in. Some explosions at the port of Bandar Abbas reported by various agencies. I was waiting to get confirmation from a more reliable agency. Reuters is now reporting 15 minutes ago that the Iranian news agency Fars stated that several sounds along with explosions were heard near the city of Bandar Abbas, adding that the origin and location of these sounds were unknown. So it's not exactly clear what it is, while all the conspiracy theories are already circulating, like the Israelis attacking to throw everything into chaos. Giorgio, are you there? Are you alive and fighting alongside us? Let's see if Giorgio is alive. In my opinion, I think there's one fundamental point. I watched Trump's discussion with the press and so on, and there's an interesting point. At a certain moment, he says he doesn't want to wait for the end of the truce, then he admits it's a war, basically. He contradicts himself. And this was picked up by many American media outlets as an attempt to hide the cost and damage of this war. The censorship is obvious, so since Giorgio seems AFK, I'll write to him on WhatsApp in the meantime. In the meantime, Eduardo, if you want to go ahead with the discussion about the U.S. military assets that were hit, along with all the satellite images, I know you made a post on X. You also did a recap of this story. It's turning out to be much more costly, which connects exactly to what Daniele was saying. That is, various countries are realizing that hosting American bases doesn't provide any protection. On the contrary, it attracts fire.
Yes, first of all, good evening, everyone. As you rightly said, there has been further confirmation, as you can see from sources, certainly not Iranian sources, but confirmation from entirely Western media outlets, about the extent of the damage that was caused during the active phase of this war, which is currently suspended. And we already knew, I had also talked about it on X, about a good part, perhaps the most spectacular part. You will surely remember we also talked about these damages in previous live streams about very important targets that were hit, such as anti-ballistic defense batteries, radars, even and
Command and
control. There's feedback. I don't know if I can be heard. No. Okay, never mind. I was saying that much of the more serious damage is already known. But what emerges from this more recent investigation, which, as was mentioned, makes use of satellite images, and in fact, briefly, Mirko already mentioned it earlier, the use of satellite images in this conflict is not trivial. Because, in fact, the United States had imposed, shortly after the start of the conflict, a sort of halt to the distribution of satellite images, clearly by the agencies and companies close to them. Despite this, we managed to document, and as you can see, others did too, a large amount of damage. And this already gives us some information. That is, today, not even the United States can basically prevent OSINT, and even less so the intelligence of rival countries, let alone access to satellite imagery from their own systems. Take, for example, China or Russia, which have constellations of satellites, but also the use of reconnaissance satellites to, as in this case, let's say, identify whether the attacks were successful or not. In short, even smaller powers or non-powers can access a very wide range of commercial satellite images, or relatively easily satellite images from, let's say, friendly countries. This is an important fact because then you will find in the sources, in fact, the entire article where you can actually, let's say, see the extent of the damage. But maybe what we need to consider is that even knowing how much damage has been done is not simple, not even for the attackers. And as Mirko was just saying, now it seems that even more damage is emerging than Iran itself had claimed, which is a remarkable fact. But on this, in my opinion, another point needs to be made in the sense that another one of the great, let's say, defeats of this American operation up to now, in my opinion, is that even if everything ended tomorrow, Iran today knows its weapons, its missiles, its drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, long range suicide drones, and so on and so on and so on. Iran knows much better than before which weapons work, how well they work, which defenses can be breached, and which ones can't be breached easily. And from what we see, Iran is probably now aware of having a potential deterrent if it were to use a large quantity of conventional weapons like these again, effective enough even against the United States in a future conflict, let's say. So in my opinion, this is
Also, two things, right, Eduardo, that I think are fundamental. When they responded to Israel, the attacks were not very precise. Do you remember when the assessment was done, Eduardo? It also came from the distances. Whereas in most of the satellite images we see of the bases in the Gulf, the strikes are very precise. There aren't random craters, etc. This shows that at a regional level, they are much more dangerous than they are in a direct exchange with Israel.
This is precisely due, in my view, to the different use of various weapons. When Iran attacks, in short, when it launches missiles at Israel, it can basically use medium-range ballistic missiles. And on one hand, they are much harder for the defender to intercept, much harder. But on the other hand, they are also much less accurate, simply because of the errors that accumulate in guidance over such a long range and so on. And also the use of drones, which, well, Israel usually manages to intercept almost all of them, so that's not very significant either. But still, even drones, at such a long distance, you can basically only use GPS guidance or something similar, which can be easily jammed and so on. Whereas in the Gulf, then I'll wrap up this topic. In the Gulf, the distance is still considerable, but shorter, and Iran can use a wide range of much more precise and even cheaper weapons, if you will. The same ballistic missiles that Iran uses in the Gulf are, let's say, short-range missiles. Then, well, categories, you can go and check how many kilometers they reach, but basically those missiles are not only cheaper, but also relatively more precise. In addition, Iran also has a small, let's say, limited number of very precise short-range missiles, which are the ones they use, potentially even against ships. So basically, there is even a more limited category in terms of the number of short-range ballistic missiles with their own terminal sensors, which is not something trivial nowadays. But even the, let's say, standard short-range missiles, because of their range and limited flight time, have much higher accuracy at these distances. In addition, the wide range of drones used by the Iranians can sometimes use terminal guidance systems at that distance. I think this was seen recently in the attack on a ship along the Gulf Coast, because at these distances, even though we're still talking about over-the-horizon guided weapons, there are ways to guide them. Basically, some drones can be guided either by using, let's say, a network of relay drones. Basically with relay drones, so that a drone can be guided during the final phase of its flight, or they can be guided, as we've seen in Ukraine, often by taking advantage of the country's cellular network. In short, near the Gulf countries' coasts, this possibility exists. All of this obviously isn't present in attacks that reach all the way to Israel, so you have to take these details into account as well, in my opinion.
So, Giorgio, I wanted to ask you, these countries leaving OPEC, what are the reasons? Could it trigger a chain reaction? Is there someone trying to take advantage of it? Because after all, it was a constraint. It limited the possible profits. In a situation like this, you'd want to be free of those constraints so you can set whatever prices you want. But feel free to correct me if I'm wrong.
It can also be the opposite, meaning instead of chasing a price increase, you might go after lowering prices if you think you can increase your market share. But rather than really trying to figure out what could happen to the price of oil, I'd say that the era of this supply monopoly is over, which had already been shrinking over time, and now even more so. In other words, it's not Saudi Arabia that rules and everyone else just does what Saudi Arabia says. There are probably some considerations that go beyond economics. It's not just that they want to control the price of oil. So to raise the price of oil, you have to reduce the supply, assuming demand stays the same. So this Gulf country, if it wants to have more revenue with higher prices, should reduce its supply, but that doesn't mean the others will reduce theirs. So it's much more complex than it seems, even though it's a simple game. I mean, I can raise the price of oil if I lower the supply. But if I lower it and others raise it, absolutely nothing happens. So I would say that for now, it's a very difficult topic.
But the timing of the decision is peculiar, obviously, right?
Yes, it's clear that right now, with everything that's happening and so on, it's a very unusual choice. But regarding the oil issue, the point is, even if the Strait of Hormuz were opened, the point is, if the wells are able to operate, if all the industrial activities around the wells, that is the refineries, are able to operate, and if all the logistics, meaning pipelines, ports, infrastructure, are able to operate in a relatively short time. If the time is relatively short, that is, if there is a truce, so the strait reopens, it's not like suddenly everything works. Everything works if everything works, meaning if the wells, the infrastructure, and so on and so on. If these don't work right away, even if you've reopened, you have a problem with the flow of oil. As long as you can use the oil reserves, this phenomenon doesn't occur, but the reserves will eventually run out. So the more serious the damage is along the entire chain, setting aside ship departures if all the damage is severe. And before you can fix them, it takes a lot of time, and the reserves you have aren't enough. That's when you have the problem of a crisis, a significant increase in prices. Let's put it this way, what could ease this crisis is some of the oil that's exported through the pipelines that cross the desert and go to the Red Sea and so on and so forth. But it's all very difficult to understand because no one is able not only to know what the damages are, but especially to know how long it will take to repair the damages. So the more time it takes, the fewer oil reserves you have to use, and the more the price of oil could rise. And so in reality, we don't really know exactly what the situation is. Here's an interesting thing. The price of oil, if you buy it right now, is much higher than the price of oil futures, which would be the price of oil sometime from now. So the markets are betting that things will get better in some time, because if I pay less for oil in 3 months than I pay today, it's because I think that in 3 months the price will be lower than what I pay today to get the barrel right away. Actually, there is a lot of uncertainty. One last thing, when people say that financial markets are not afraid, that's not true, because the American stock market is rising, all thanks to high tech and partly because of oil. 95% of US stocks are rising little or not at all. High-tech stocks are going up, so with this oil crisis, it's assumed that high-tech is immune and oil producers are assumed to be immune. So these two sectors are going up and the rest are not. Since they are important sectors, the index goes up, making it seem like the markets aren't afraid, which isn't true. The other thing is that Trump's economic policies are judged by the markets not on short-term rates, but on long-term yields, which have gone up. And so the situation, finance, apart from the fact that finance doesn't know how things will turn out, obviously, since humans can't know the future, but even if you look at it, it's clear that there isn't any kind of support. All that can be said is that we're almost finished. There's a situation similar to when Putin invaded Ukraine. According to a famous joke from Moscow, he thought he had German industry behind him, the Wehrmacht, but he didn't have either of those things. 4 years earlier, he thought he could take Paris in a few days. Some said even in 3. There's also a strong case of underestimation in the Iranian case. I'll say one last thing. Thanks to sanctions that have lasted for decades, The Iranians have industrialized. They are a relatively industrialized country, considering they are a developing country. They produce more than 1 million cars and have 660 companies listed on the stock exchange. So thinking that it's a country of small villages that you can bomb and they'll surrender is a fatal mistake. It's not Afghanistan. It's industrialized and also quite advanced. It's not advanced, it's not Switzerland, but it's not Afghanistan either. Plus, there are 90 million people, and I'd like to see you put boots on the ground in a situation like this. So this whole thing risks turning into a big mess.
I wanted to ask you this, Giorgio, which I think is very interesting. I was also looking at the reasons why some countries entered the Second World War, because they had 12 years of oil reserves, in the case of Japan.
See.
Yeah, everyone here, including the Chinese, at best we have between a month and a half and 2 months. So the ability to manage crisis situations like this, even just this stalemate where, yes, no one's shooting, the markets aren't going crazy, but still the oil isn't getting through. If this back and forth game keeps going, and we'll see how real these negotiations are, what moves can we make in Europe to keep prices down? I was looking 2 weeks ago, it was 1.6, 1.7. Now it's already almost at 2, just to give you an idea about gasoline. What is our capacity economically and in terms of reserves to try to cushion or mitigate this situation? Whether they're shooting or not, how long can we keep this up? What if it lasts 3 months?
In 3 months, your reserves will be insufficient. And so since you don't have an immediate replacement, you can restart the coal power plants. All right, but it's not like your solar panels can replace it, let alone nuclear power, which takes decades to bring back. So you rule out nuclear, which is mostly mentioned to say, let's stop depending on oil, let's switch to nuclear. But nuclear takes a few decades, so we remove it. There's a possibility to use more alternative energy sources. But even there, you have to install them, build them, hope for the best in the short term. You have a serious problem. You can make it only if the reserves hold up. As long as the wells aren't damaged, the infrastructure isn't broken. But even if you use an open Hormuz scenario, the problem is the damage in the production and loading of the oil onto the ships. The worst case scenario is that the wells are destroyed and the ships can't get through. The next worst is that the ships can get through, but you're not able to produce enough. So no matter how you look at it, you have to rely on reserves. And that's where it becomes the crucial point of the whole story. The mistake that could be made in politics is this. In the short term, you can also help by cutting excise taxes and then helping those who would find themselves in trouble with high prices. But if the crisis lasts, besides the fact that this way you risk weakening the state budget, but the worst thing is that you would create an incentive to do nothing, whereas an incentive to do more comes if prices go up. Because at that point you become more efficient, you use the car less, you do this and that. Each of these choices is more complicated than the last. And where? The only hope, and here I'll finish my speech, the only hope is that seeing that everyone is suffering, there is an incentive to find some kind of agreement. I mean, no one benefits from going on like this. Not the Iranians, who have no money because they can't sell oil, not the Asians because they don't receive it, not the United States because they've gotten involved in a war they can't win, and that's where the problem lies. The Israelis have every interest in destroying Iran because if they destroy Iran, they'll end up with the Turks on their doorstep. So for them too, a weak Iran is fine, but not one that's too defeated. So the hope is that everyone understands that the best situation is to somehow come to an agreement.
By the way, I've seen some analysis lately talking about the fact that, in any case, people were hoping Iranian stockpiles would build up. In reality, they can basically produce and refine what they need for their own domestic consumption at this stage. And a question for the cat, sorry, I meant for Paolo. What's your take on it? All of it? This whole back and forth negotiation thing, which, by the way, is fascinating because these are the famous negotiations in the final stage where you can't even see them happening. There aren't even the two teams meeting, and I think it's basically done through messages passed back and forth.
It reminded me of those childhood games where you'd whisper a word to someone and see what the last person heard. Me. Micro Garo joins in too, who's now part of the scene. Here's how I see it. I would be quite worried about the course of history, because every time they start negotiating somewhere in some corner, there's always someone attaching missiles or something to the fighter bombers. So since things happen in threes and we've already had two, the third one is still missing. All this talk we've had about negotiations, reopening Hormuz, closing it again, I block it, you block it, no, I'll block it before you and better than you. We're not mentioning the elephant in the room, which is Israel, which would really take just a nanosecond to blow things up, and they know it very well. Let's call it that. It's not even a balance. It's more like watching each other from a distance, and they have the capabilities and the means. It's activity. Then Eduardo will be more precise. It's not like it can strike anywhere it wants, but even a small attack, even more than just a demonstration, is enough to bring it down, regardless of whether the Americans are able to support it or not. At that point, the ball would temporarily be in Iran's court. What do you mean? That if Iran, in the face of a new attack carried out only by the Israelis that would blow everything up, didn't react in any way? And in this sense, if the Americans also didn't join that attack, it would be one of the indirect ways to push Israel out of this dispute. Because it's like saying, look, you tried, I'm not backing you up, the other side isn't reacting, so maybe you should calm down a bit, but that's just my opinion. And usually it never happens, judging by the look on his face. Microgato, he's not convinced either. All things considered, though, it could also be, that could also be it. Negotiations? Someone wrote, or rather said, that in these last years, 2 years, let's say, country, credibility and assertiveness, which is the most important thing for a superpower, that is keeping your word. Watch what you say, because you must keep your word. So a country that no longer has assertiveness and value, its word means little. All that's left is a country with enormous military power. That's just a little bit too little. It no longer inspires trust. Realize that a superpower that only inspires fear and no longer inspires trust, that no longer inspires trust. It's a power that, for better or worse, sooner or later is destined to be replaced by someone who inspires a little less fear and a little more trust. And in this light, I think we can also interpret the fact that China, despite everything, is not exactly happy with the current situation. Do we see it as the main player, or do we fail to see it because it doesn't look the way we imagine a main player should? This is also an important thing because we imagine that the rest of the world behaves the way we do. So at this point, we'll do this, we'll go there, we'll set things up, we'll act. Then you realize that the Chinese, coming from another world, from another way of thinking, do what a Chinese person would do or has always done. We probably expect them to take a leading role. Right now, China, because it follows its own path and operates according to its own culture, seems to be on a path that's almost already written. Look, the real damage isn't about not having missiles anymore or having used up the stockpiles or not being able to replenish them, because after all, that's an industrial issue. The real damage is that as soon as you mention the presidency of the United States, everyone laughs. Even fascism and Nazism didn't reach that level of satire when they made caricatures of Bokasile, if anyone remembers that. Losing that is huge, huge reputational damage, as they sometimes say now, right? For some unfortunate reason, these negotiations, which, as you say, are negotiations between people who see each other, they don't even talk. They leave little notes under the tree, somewhere like that. If even this time, while negotiating in this way, something very, very difficult, something happens that betrays the spirit of a negotiation, I think that truly the remaining, if there are any, the remaining negotiating abilities of the United States, not just with Iran, but with the rest of the world, are shattered. What remains then? Force, the certainty that when, maybe they don't tell you, but if somehow they feel like it, they take you and bomb you. Because you didn't give them the bases in Sicily, because you didn't import meat from Montano, because you don't want estrogen-treated chickens. Here.
I'll give you a couple more facts. Trump said yesterday, assuming that they were willing to give what was agreed upon, which might be a big assumption, Operation Peak Fury will end and the blockade will allow the Strait of Hormuz to be reopened. If we don't agree, the bombings will start, and unfortunately, they will be at a much higher level of intensity than before. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. This matter is done. The day before, some countries had practically blocked the use of their airspace, and so on. In my opinion, it was a way to get in the way, like saying we're not on board with any resumption. Maybe also a political message. Next, bye, 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 bye. Bye. Hi, today, an hour before the live stream, actually even less than an hour before the live stream, the Gulf states, with the institutions blocking the Freedom Project, which would be the reopening of the strait, and so they give back access to the bases and the airspace. I'm saying this because while we're talking, a lot of strange news is going around. I trust Winter because he's one of my moderators. There are raids on various locations along the Iranian coast, attributed to an unspecified enemy. Earlier, both Reuters and various agencies were talking about strange explosions. When you put all these things together, and it's also true that we were really close to chaos, in the sense that the Israelis had already started to destroy bridges, attack some oil facilities, and then suddenly everything stopped. It was just a step away from mutual retaliation.
Yes, definitely, yes. But I still think that we are absolutely in the middle of this situation right now. Because what advantage does Israel have in accepting any kind of American pseudo-victory where it declares victory and leaves, with Iran not having been wiped out as the Israeli leadership demanded? I remember their minister Katz saying, we're here to bring Iran back to the dark ages. Well, something like that. So it doesn't achieve any strategic goal except for a general weakening of its main opponent. It doesn't happen. I mean, it's like a game being suspended at 0-0, and that's not enough. So the risk is that Israel wants to play for extra time in their idea of winning, if not in extra time, then at least in a penalty shootout. But this isn't a game, excuse the metaphor. It's not the kind of game that can be completed to finish from Israel's point of view at 0-0 or in a tie 1-1. Because it has invested too much, it has put its credibility as a state on the line. It is under the scrutiny of public opinion worldwide. There are also other consequences. Israel must also consider that many of its citizens and co-religionists live abroad, and they report what people in the countries where they live feel about Israeli policy. In light of this, which is still a high price, even in this sense, rightly or wrongly, Netanyahu's government wants to bring home a definitive result. And in its plan, the definitive result is to put Iran in a position for the next 30 or 40 years to be completely out of any possible dispute, something that hasn't even started yet. On the contrary, this war has, all things considered, clarified two very distinct lines of alliances, which were not so distinct at the beginning of the war. I'm referring, starting from the most recent, excuse me if I take a minute, to the exit of the United Arab Emirates from OPEC, which is not just a matter of oil. It's also a matter of oil. It's also a matter of figuring out how to monetize it. a resource that they believe, all things considered, that before too long, I'm talking about 30 years or so, might not be so valuable. And on the fact that they can market their oil, because in any case, they have a pipeline that takes it out of the Gulf. It's not much for 1.8 million, 1.5 million lipa of things. But if you only look at the oil, you don't really understand much. The United Arab Emirates said, we've decided to side with the Americans and with the Israelis. Basically, it means against you other Arabs who are on the other side. On the other side, there's Saudi Arabia, which is starting to say, but maybe we can also reach an agreement with Tehran. Pushed by whom? Pushed by Pakistan, which in turn is pushed by China. These are two big blocks. If these two blocks are clear today, they're much clearer than they were before the operation, before the closure of an open strait that Trump carried out. It depends on which of the two blocks ends up winning, because one of them will push the other out. These two entities, which have very different strategic political references, will not be able to coexist. The Saudis are simply saying, since we are the biggest on this side and you are the biggest on that side, if we have a couple of major powers that guarantee stability while we build a different framework, more or less independent from the physical and military presence of the United States, let's try to get by for the next 30 years or so. Against this line of thought, it says, no, we cannot free ourselves from the Americans in any way. I'm talking about the United Arab Emirates, I'm talking about Israel, and I'm talking about the United States, which says we aim for an architecture that, all things considered, is very similar to that of past years, of past decades, and that sees them as central. The United States as a physical military presence, as the presence of their currency in oil trade, like a world in which still, in that part of the world, the United States are the ones who call the shots and manage the situation. So the idea of dropping a bomb means hitting this kind of, in my opinion, balance that is currently very fragile. There are these two big factions that, in this moment of truce, are watching each other. Tipping the balance to one side or the other could be why I see only Israel as likely to seriously disrupt the truce, hoping that Iran will do the same. Forcing the Americans at that point to take up arms again, to carry out another round of bombings and to declare for the 14th time in a row victory. Because we've gotten to 9, I think. I don't know. 9, 10, I lost count. Does anyone know? 9 times? How many times was it?
He doesn't even know himself.
This thing I told Mike Rogato, all in all, he likes it. He likes it. Looking at his face, yes.
Here's another update since news is coming in as we talk. American intelligence says Iran could withstand a Hormuz blockade for months.
Historically, it has held out for 3 months. It has held out for 3 already historically. As a historical fact, the blockade, nothing moves. You wouldn't even get an aspirin or a pack of coffee. It held out for 3 months. So they have it in their social and economic memory and in the way they tell their own story. So it wouldn't be the first time. And, you know, every generation needs its heroes. Probably this attitude is creating a sense of solidarity, a feeling of we won't bow to them either, which is one of the powerful weapons in modern wars. We see it in Ukraine as well, for example. It's one of the weapons that Putin didn't expect to encounter.
Daniele, while all this is happening, Israel is continuing to do its own thing. The book said that they strike everywhere without discrimination. So I'd like to see you and Giorgio together on this. I mean, there's a separate Israeli plan that's operating beyond what's happening between Trump and the Iranians. And the other question, which will be for Giorgio, do we have those 4 months, Giorgio, to exist?
And I have to answer right away.
But yes, even before Daniele.
So the problem is the variables you're reasoning about. Suppose you have the possibility to cover the demand for oil for X barile. The problem is not that you have a stock whose amount, X barrels available, or in Italy because you have stored it or bought it from someone who stored it and sells it to you. That's not the point. It's the other variables. In other words, we don't do what we mentioned before. The wells, the chemical industry connected to the wells, the infrastructure. Okay? Since you don't know those other variables, you're not able to estimate how long your oil reserves will allow you to keep going as if nothing happened. So it's just a guessing game, and the answer is just a guess. So for now, I see that there's a change in the coverage of these topics, which essentially claims that the situation is definitely getting worse, precisely because they're starting to take into account the variables I'm talking about. I'm not saying I invented them. By now, it's widely known that your problem is the well, the chemical industry, and the infrastructure. That's the point. From there, you can understand how long it will take to have a significant oil supply again. But since it's hard to understand this because it doesn't just depend on the war, it also depends on the damage that has been done, and nobody knows exactly what that is. So how long does it take then to say we have reserves? It's fine if you want to reassure the population by saying, ladies and gentlemen, we are very, very, very well organized. But in reality, you can't know for sure. On the other hand, there are too many variables and nobody knows them. So I would say that my answer is, how long can we keep going? And obviously, I don't know. Probably at some point they won't be enough. If the situation is serious at that point there, you have a choice as the political leadership. Either you let prices rise, hoping there will be a reaction, or you intervene to keep prices down. Of the two options, intervening to keep prices down. This one is more popular, the other one is less so, and probably for this reason it will be chosen less likely.
Before us, they were talking about the fact that, if it lasts a month, 2 months, then it gets averaged out over the year.
I went around telling people about it too.
But if it lasts 4 months, I'll steal your lines. If it lasts 4 months, 5 months, who is going to absorb it? And especially the assets we have to manage that kind of crisis. That's the problem, because you can have all the assets you want, but if they're not enough, you can't even manage it. And Trump seems to be dragging us toward this solution. I think that even this back and forth with Saudi Arabia, with other countries telling them, no, don't use our airspace, these are both technical messages, meaning maybe they were about to take off and they were saying, look, soon we'll need it, and also political messages to stay out of it, even though it then becomes difficult to stay out of it.
Sí.
China is buying, yes, but it also has much larger reserves. It's true, it consumes much more, but it has
also reserves, and it has the possibility to use coal.
There are estimates of how much they can cover with coal instead of oil. There are probably figures on what percentage that is.
I don't know them, but most likely they exist. But let's say that from this point of view, they're in a good position because they can. They have large oil reserves and they can switch to coal. In the United States, they have a more than sufficient domestic oil supply for internal consumption. The point, however, is a different matter. But the point of the issue isn't that the United States doesn't produce enough oil to avoid importing it and consuming it themselves. The point is that if oil prices rise worldwide, Americans start selling oil at higher prices to the rest of the world. This explains why the price of gasoline in the United States has gone up a lot, even though they produce as much as before. Nothing at all has changed. The problem is that I, as an American, know that in Europe or elsewhere, the price is like that, so I sell there and the price goes up. So they're not immune, even though they have their own production, because the markets are interdependent. So are you saying that those who have their own production capacity are immune? In the case of the United States, no, because international prices draw U.S. production onto the global market, or they keep it in the United States, provided that prices match those in the rest of the world, so they end up paying just as much. And there's a subtle point to consider. Here, the price of oil at the pump doesn't rise as much as it does at the wellhead. That's because there are excise taxes that, let's say, act as a buffer. In the US, excise taxes are nearly non-existent, so oil prices...
So it's kind of like a spring effect. Here, they're more compressed.
There are no excise taxes, so it immediately affects the pump price. So long live the excise tax. Saying long live the excise tax is hard, but in this case, let's go with it.
I wouldn't campaign on that, Georgia.
I'm not trying to say long live the excise tax, no.
Long live the Sisa. It's a beautiful pass between La Spezia and Parma.
Yes.
Yes.
Daniele, since you've also been in those areas, you follow this closely. No, the issue of the parallel Israeli plan. But I also wanted to see a bit of American public opinion, since more or less everyone thinks they've been dragged into this crazy project by the Israelis.
Microphone. Here I am then. This is a very important point. The Gaza situation, meaning the Israeli reaction to the Hamas attack on October 7, 2023, it has impacted and radicalized American public opinion, as we mentioned a few weeks ago. There is a generational divide. So let's say the Democrats of my generation, the baby boomers, you could say, they remain largely pro-Israel. Young Democrats are, as you can see from the polls, increasingly in favor of the Palestinians. So to put it simply, what's the striking thing that's happening? The same division is also occurring within Republican circles. Even among young Republicans, in fact, we are starting to see signs that they're calling for intervention. For the United States of America to cut military aid, which I believe is $3.5 billion a year to Israel, is not a significant amount. Like the one, for example, that in 2 weeks, Trump threw away, because I think the calculation is around $25 billion in 2 months, which is what this operation against Iran has cost so far. But the signal is tremendous, even if you think back. The election of the mayor of New York has deeply divided one of the most important Jewish communities in the world, if not the most important, and influential in the world. So there is a, how can I say, this is the first time since the founding of the State of Israel that all this has happened. Let's say there's also a very understandable historical explanation. My generation grew up considering the Shoah, the Holocaust, as the absolute evil, even if not directly. We were greatly influenced by the incredible gravity of what happened to humanity. As the years go by, it's clear that you tend to forget, and you also see situations that make you question your scale of values. I'll just give you an example. What is happening in the West Bank is incredibly serious. But not because there's Netanyahu's government or another government, but because there is a part of the Israelis living in the occupied territories who openly want to get rid of the presence of Palestinians and want to do so by violating every democratic norm. In democracies, you go to the polls, you vote, then it's decided who governs and who is in the opposition. Here, clearly, a part of Israeli society is outside the control even of the Israeli authorities. Don't underestimate this, because in my opinion, it's much, much more serious for Israeli society than what's happening with Hezbollah. I've noticed something. I was there. Yes, you did well to remind me. I was there. For those who know Israel a bit, if you have in mind what the map looks like. Right at the very top. At the very top, there's one that was part of the choice. There is one. Metula which is a small town, is called the Finger of Israel because it's surrounded on three sides by the Lebanese. Immediately to the right is Syria. To the north there are, if you go to Metula, 20 meters from you, Hezbollah fighters pass by waving their flag. Why am I saying this? Because it's true that, as we already pointed out a month and a half ago, for those who had the chance to listen to us, there is a division within Lebanese society. Among the Shiites, the part, let's say the more political part of the Shiites, says we need to reach a compromise and try to negotiate with Israel. But for example, I noticed something. The tens of thousands of Lebanese Shiites who lived in southern Lebanon, when they returned to southern Lebanon, in the past few days, many of them were waving Hezbollah flags. That is my impression, but it's really just the impression of a street reporter that Hezbollah still maintains considerable support. In southern Lebanese society, which is not entirely Shia, there are some villages that are Christian, for example. But I have the impression that the split within Shia society is not as strong as many people think. Even in Jerusalem, they might have thought so. That is, if you think back, a month and a half ago, we were there. We pointed out that Trump and Netanyahu were in fact conducting two wars, two different wars. They were bombing the same place, but with two different strategies. At a certain point, if you look a few weeks ago, Netanyahu basically stopped fighting against the Iranians. In fact, he had to accept that the whole game was in Trump's hands, and he shifted the focus to Lebanon, finding 90% of Israeli society, even those in the opposition, hate him. They want him in jail. And many think he deserves it, not for political reasons, but for corruption, for crimes, common crimes. Allow me to use this term. Him, his wife, and his son. His son, who has been in Miami for 3 years, escorted by Israeli agents. And he never goes to fight. He never goes to fight. His son Yair is in Miami, so you have a problem. The country is at war. In fact, it has been mobilized for 2.5 years. Anyone who knows the story of Israel, anyone who knows the story of Daniela.
They were asking exactly this. How long can Israel afford all this mobilization? Go on.
So who listened to us at the beginning? If you go and check on the Jerusalem Post website just this evening, 2 very interesting analyses were posted. The Jerusalem Post is a center-right newspaper. It's usually very critical of Netanyahu. Of course, it's not a far-left paper. It's a newspaper, but okay. 2 very interesting analyses on this point, which always say, listen to this. It's been 2.5, 3 years that we've kept society mobilized as long as you say we have a goal. Before Christmas, Netanyahu said, let's bring down the Iranian leadership. Well, it's May, and not only has the Iranian leadership not fallen, but it has also become more radicalized. Second, let's drive Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon and they'll stop bombing northern Israel. That's great if you can do it, but not if it takes 2.5 years. Every day the media, the Israeli media say, we hit 10 Hezbollah bases that were right there. UNIFIL wasn't watching them. And then you say, okay, now that you've hit them, the problem is solved. No, that's the political point. You have clearly gotten yourself stuck in a situation where you can't move forward or backward. In the elections in October, because we always talk about the elections that I insist Trump will try not to hold in November, but Netanyahu.
Daniela, I want to give you something else, because the Jerusalem Post, as you say, is also caustic toward Netanyahu. The question they're asking is exactly this. Israel needs a long-term strategy on Iran. They're afraid of the American and Iranian agreement. Because then one asks, all this 3-year war, what did we do it for? If in the end we don't go and eliminate what for them was the main problem.
Exactly. This is one of the 2 analyses I was referring to. because Israeli society is interesting. It's a very complicated society, but also very vital. I mean, where the political debate, for anyone who has visited or seen a meeting of the Israeli parliament or the Knesset, the Italian parliament looks like a gathering of gentle souls in comparison. Sometimes it resembles certain scenes from South Korea even more. The society is very divided, it's very argumentative, and it's also a relatively small society where the leading groups know each other. Talking. I'll give you an example. When I talk about Metula, really, do you see? Or if you went to Gaza from Sderot, you could see Hamas missile positions on the balconies in Gaza facing Sderot. There, the country is very small. We're used to looking at these countries on maps that don't make us realize how small it is and how claustrophobic the situation is. If you can't actually do it because you've basically emptied southern Lebanon of its population, you've forced the people to leave. So anyone among us, even myself, who isn't an expert like General Capitini, understands that if you clear out a part of a country, well, you clean it out. And then when the civilian population returns, things are calm. But obviously, either you haven't cleaned it out completely, or the collusion, I insist, even among the civilian population is very strong. Anyway, that's the point. That's what analysts are also saying in the Jerusalem Post tonight. But you, after 2.5 years, what have you achieved? Why you? Netanyahu, are you at risk of ending up like Trump, who is at risk of ending up like Putin? I mean, all those who are fighting first. Giorgio Alfaras, let me say hello to him. And Anna was also talking about the empire. After 18 years in Washington, I have to tell you that the American empire was in decline, and you didn't need us foreigners to understand that. Many American analysts were saying it. The truth is that the United States of America went from being an empire to a superpower. Let me point out that the other day, there was this blunder by the British ambassador in Washington, who said to a group of students, in reality, the so-called special historical relationship between the United States and Great Britain, which was largely an invention, actually only exists between the United States and Israel. In other words, the empire has become a superpower that actually has very few allies. Let me point out one last thing, Mirko, to also talk about matters that concern Italy. I noticed that when Trump the other day threatened to cut the American presence in Italy, many analysts, certainly not anti-American or polemical, made some observations. And they pointed out to the Americans that the bases in Italy, not in Germany, but in Italy, are infinitely more useful to the Americans than to the Italians. In this historical context, in this geostrategic context. And so also on this point, the fact that you've seen it, Italian polls show that 80% of Italian public opinion considers Trump at best a colossal blunderer. Look, not even during the Vietnam War were there results like these. Because it's not referring to the United States as a country. It's referring to the political leadership of the United States. Bunglers. As long as he was having Latino dishwashers who were taking their kids to school in America arrested. Someone who lives in Ancona or Perugia or wherever you want doesn't really care. But when you go to get gas and you find it at €2.12 a liter, you start to wonder why it got to this price. And if Trump's whole strategy is that before the elections he promised us 100 times, then it goes back to how it was before. Gasoline. Well, no Italian is convinced by someone who reasons like this. Because Giorgio Arparas, who tells you that making gas prices go up is one thing, but bringing them down is a much bigger deal. Un affaraccio. He's given up on being able to quickly get the situation back in order.
Non si sa mai. Between Israeli software, Iranians blocking the internet, Russians blocking the internet, the world is a bit more locked down than usual. Let's get to that issue, which I find very interesting, the impact, even the silent Chinese presence in this story, because they still sent ships and were monitoring the situation. And by the way, the sources you sent me are Chinese sources themselves. That's also interesting from the point of view of reserves. They come directly from the China Energy Transformation Program, so we know their sources declared by them. Please.
That's, let's say, a sort of think tank that also uses Chinese sources. So anyway, I think that's what comes closest to the official sources, which of course reflect what they themselves say. And basically, I came across this document mainly when I touched on the topic of what China is doing in this conflict. So basically, as you know, obviously China, as we already said before, it's still involved in this conflict from the point of view of energy supply, especially in the sense that not only is a friendly country being affected, but above all, a country that's an economic partner. And this is the main reason. And we can start from this very brief piece of information that I can give you. According to this data, which refers to previous years, so the most recent years for which we have data, so from 2024-25, to what extent was I able to calculate China's dependence on oil passing through Hormuz? It's not, let's say, irreversible. It's still significant in the sense that using these numbers, it amounted to something. About 30% of all the oil that China uses. In past years, it actually came from the Strait of Hormuz. But if you look at the mix you see here in this chart, the energy mix, so basically the combination of energy sources that China uses in its economy, oil was about 67%, and you should also add gas because some of the gas that arrives in China also passes through Hormuz. But you understand that it's not something minor, it's something, let's say, enormously impactful, though it must be said. And here, I don't know. We need to see whether even that small percentage can be replaced, because losing even that modest share could still be critical. So having said that, it's clear that there is a sort of impact, obviously significant on the Chinese economy, especially if, as was mentioned earlier, if this crisis goes on for more months, even the large Chinese reserves might not be able to cushion the blow anymore. There are people who have been wondering for months now why China isn't doing anything. No, there's an entire group of people, obviously, those who are perhaps less sympathetic to, let's say, if you'll allow me the term, the West. There's an entire group of pro-Chinese people who say, but China isn't doing anything. Why doesn't it intervene? Why doesn't it send weapons and so on and so forth? Which, in my opinion, from what I've found out, is basically true, in the sense that China, from the point of view of military support, but even just support in sending weapons, selling weapons to Iran, not only since the beginning of this crisis, but even before, going back to when, as you may recall, there was the 12-day war, and even before that, there were exchanges. In short, attacks with Israel in previous years, so throughout this whole period, China, it's not that we can say, we can't point to a strong Chinese intention to militarily strengthen Iran or to open its own weapons arsenal to Iranian buyers. And one of the factors that should be considered, in my opinion, besides the factor you mentioned earlier, in my opinion, very interesting, in a very interesting way, in general, that is the fact that it's not certain that China wants to behave as, in fact, one would expect, let's say, a military superpower that wants to steal global hegemony would behave. Well, one of the main factors is precisely the fact that China today, militarily, even if it wanted to in the Indian Ocean, can't do much. In reality, it can do very little. We already mentioned it, that is, we briefly touched on this topic in another live stream here.
We wrote about it in the Pacific Book a year and a half ago. Everything was clear, the fleet, etc. But just like for the Americans, they can't give up their bases in Europe because otherwise they wouldn't have any power projection. The Chinese have a really impressive new fleet, etc., but very few bases.
Exactly, yes. Basically, you summed up what I was about to say in the sense that you have the gift for summarizing things. You basically nailed it. The point is, China has this fleet that is not only large, but also expensive. They've also spent a ton of money on it in recent decades, but it's become very modern in recent decades, very capable. It's the second largest in the world, and even more so near its own coast, so in the Pacific, obviously close to China. According to many analysts, it is already capable of having some chances of winning a clash with the US Navy over Taiwan. However, if we move to a scenario like the Indian Ocean, or in any case towards the Strait of Hormuz, China is severely limited, as in the deployment of naval forces. First, due to the lack of bases. Second, due to the shortage of a fleet of long-range supply ships, which is another thing that sets it apart from the US Navy, another weakness in a sense. Because in the past, even the Soviet Union, did you see earlier? That map already showed a more extensive network of bases compared to what China has today. And even for the Soviet Union, it was a weak point for the Soviet Navy. However, as you can see, it already had a fairly substantial network of naval bases. Or in any case, countries that, according to the agreements that had been made, were basically supposed to allow Soviet military ships to resupply during the Cold War. Today, China has only one military and naval base outside its own territory, which is the one in Djibouti. It's a small base, the one you see here, opened in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. It has a pier that can accommodate 34 military ships or a large military ship like an aircraft carrier. And yet they use it, of course. To this day, China practically constantly deploys a small naval group in the Indian Ocean, usually consisting of a pair of ships supported by a supply vessel. And this has been going on for many years. However, in the case of a hypothetical conflict, and this is where you can see that China can't even try to use this card as a threat. In this sector, this base would first of all be hardly usable because in Djibouti, as you can see, there is the Chinese base, but there are also all the Western bases, which are even bigger, and above all, Djibouti itself. It is basically impossible for China to resupply in a war scenario. It doesn't even have a runway long enough to land large planes, and it doesn't have significant defenses either. So apart from this small base, China would basically have to send a naval task force from its own waters and keep resupplying it with its fleet of supply ships. But to put it simply, it's very limited. So China doesn't just have a number of modern high-quality combat ships, but now it also has a large number of combat ships overall. However, it doesn't have a supply fleet capable of operating far from its own waters for weeks or months. Basically, what could we estimate that China might be able to do in the short term if it wanted to, even though it won't? Probably, if it wanted to threaten a military intervention, at most it could support it based on what we know about the capability of these supply ships. Probably 2 or 3 small groups, which are about 2 or 3 pairs of destroyers, frigates, very, very few, if the opponent is the US Navy. With all the allies and all the support from the bases, basically from the coalition. So China, this should be kept in mind militarily. It can't even play its card there. I return to what Capitini said earlier. The fact that it's in this situation today means that China never planned to play this card, when in fact it was building a navy that is formidable in the Pacific, but that is not designed to project power into other oceans. So this is also a fact to consider. And to wrap up on China, here's an interesting side note. It came out in the last few hours or the last few days. Finally, a new Chinese weapon is being used in this conflict. The funny thing, a photo of this Chinese weapon came out, which is basically one of the prototypes of Chinese-made laser anti-drone defenses from recent years. But there hasn't been a photo of this system in Iranian service. But in the United Arab Emirates, basically, it turned out that the Emirates bought some and are testing or using them against Iran in this conflict. So this also makes you think then,
the most concrete and, let's say, kinetic support that's been spotted, it's not from the Iranian side.
It's not true that they do absolutely nothing, in the sense that China does supply components to Iranian industry. Obviously, they trade. And also one of the ships that the United States had boarded during the naval blockade, it seems it contained Chinese components for missile manufacturing. So it's not true that they do absolutely nothing. But as you can see, it's not exactly the behavior, let's say, of a superpower that wants to go to war. So, and actually, I would like to close on something else, another topic, which I think is interesting, because earlier we talked about how about the difference, in fact, let's say in terms of image, that emerges from this conflict between the great powers. That is China, in fact, which comes across as maybe relatively detached, but still a power that seems to be a sort of adult in the room. So it doesn't escalate, it keeps to itself, let's say, and absolutely does not attack the other side in this case. The United States. First of all, we talked about a military embarrassment because it's still a power of the rank and the military spending that the United States has. This was not expected. But above all, we rightly talked, in my opinion, about the loss of credibility of what should be the global superpower, the global policeman, or even from the point of view of the global economy, the one that guarantees order and well-being, the global economy. Among the various losses of credibility, we missed a big one tonight, in my opinion, which is another element that I see. I smile. But in reality, there's not much to laugh about. In the sense that among the many outbursts from Trump lately, this week there was a rather curious one. We mentioned, I think, the name Project Freedom earlier, basically last Sunday, between Sunday and Monday. Trump posted this post on his social media, where he said he was launching this supposed Project Freedom. Basically, he was giving a sort of green light to the commercial ships blocked in the Gulf from many countries, as you can imagine, also with a humanitarian tragedy because all the crews are stuck on these ships. In short, he was saying that basically from Monday they could start to facilitate the exit of these merchant ships. The Strait of Hormuz was partially reopened. Basically, they were encouraging an attempt to break through the Iranian blockade and, among other things, presented it as a sort of agreement reached with Iran. So it's not like he was saying, let's try, let's go, let's fight. Now, maybe because Trump says so many things and every week there's something new, this didn't make much noise. But in my opinion, it's another huge sign of unreliability to an embarrassing degree. Meaning that if we look at what happened, even about an hour before his post, so obviously he must have prepared this move at least an hour before his post. A merchant ship tried to pass through Hormuz on the side where Trump said there would be this new corridor, and it was hit by the Iranians. In the following 2 days, other merchant ships tried as well. 3 more ships were hit. 2 were hit while trying to pass, and 2 others near the coast of the United Arab Emirates. So Iran basically not only didn't agree, but also managed to hit the ships that tried to do what Trump said could be done. Trump had also said that the US Navy would escort and protect these ships. If they tried to do that, it didn't work. In all this, the only actual American element in this Project Freedom so far is the entry. It seems even here it's not exactly 100%, but it seems that 2 American destroyers, while the merchant ships were trying to leave, the American destroyers entered the Gulf, and as of today, they should still be inside the Gulf.
A small clarification, if you allow me, about this whole "we'll escort you" thing. The United States Navy never said "we'll escort you." They offered a sort of medium to long-range umbrella provided by aircraft, satellite surveillance, and at sea by some helicopters against the small boats. This and the recommendation to stay close to the coast of Oman to avoid the mines. This is what the United States was offering. No one offered to escort the ships, saying, look, we guarantee you this kind of more or less extensive umbrella, which should theoretically work. At this point, it's up to you, ship owners, and secondly, the ship captains, to see if what we're offering is enough or not to get yourselves out of harm's way. The big advertising pitch is over. We're doing this not to break the blockade that we ourselves have put in place, but to allow the crews to eat, drink, and return to normal life as a humanitarian gesture. The fact that the ship owners and captains in the Gulf replied, yes, we're very pleased, that's fine, we'll take it into account and let you know. Because practically no one took the offer seriously in terms of navigation safety for that short stretch of sea. Those few who took it seriously, as you rightly pointed out, what happened to them? Let's say it was a plan that even the United States Navy said, look, we can't escort anyone into Hormuz. Sorry for the interruption.
No, actually, it's useful because I probably remembered it wrong. So I went to look up the tweet. Actually, maybe I'm too optimistic because he says, we will help guide you out of this disaster. Basically,
So let's say we'll show you the way. You go ahead, exactly. Listen to the voice. Yes, come towards me. I'm the one waving my arms outside the minefield. There, that's it.
having said that, actually, all the ships that have been hit seem to have been hit right on that route near Oman that they pointed out. So another great move. And another thing that both the Iranians and the Americans partly agree on is that those two destroyers seem to have not been hit anyway, because we have no evidence that they were hit by the Iranians, but they were, in short, targeted. That is, the Americans say they went in, obviously in a glorious way, brought in by helicopters under enemy fire, and they made it. But even the Iranians said something like, we fired warning shots at them. So even here, the truth is hard to understand, but they probably did actually go in. I also found a satellite image of what seemed to be those two destroyers the day after inside the Gulf. It's a pretty poor image, let's say, because it's from low-resolution satellites. Judging by the length, they seem to be them, but we're not sure anyway. All of this, in fact, this whole story, Trump also made another post saying no. Actually, since Pakistan asked us, the negotiations are going so well. We're stopping this process mainly because it was an obstacle to negotiations, even though the reason wasn't entirely clear. Obviously, and this is, let's say, the latest, in a certain sense, the latest Trump story, I would say, of this week. Maybe, oh God, the ones that are happening as we speak now, maybe there will be others, but it's another big blow. Here it is. You see the satellite image. That should be one of the two destroyers, as you can tell from this horrible image. These are the satellites, the free ones, the Sentinel ones, which are very useful because they are accessible to everyone and they pass by frequently. You can tell by the length, in the sense that there's a scale. You can calculate how long that ship is, and knowing how long American destroyers are. More or less, you can use the process of elimination. Obviously, with that quality, you can't be completely sure. It also depends on, in this case, the quality is even lower than usual. It's really awful, but in my opinion, it gives us a good clue. So, as I was saying, to conclude. So again, Trump hinted to some people that, as he was saying, in general. Fortunately, not everyone listened to him, but only some did, and they paid the price. By the way, even a French ship was hit, a French container ship. Can you believe it? For the second time, at least, unless they forgot one. For the second time. Trump said that the blockade, or at least he hinted that the blockade could be bypassed, and this already happened weeks ago. I remember we talked about it. It had already happened once before when Trump made a tweet in which he basically hinted again that it was possible to get through. And Iran had also attacked the ships, or at least pushed back and threatened the ships. So I wonder at this point, whatever Trump says from now on, how can anyone on a diplomatic level, but also even at the level of commercial companies, give the slightest credibility to what he says?
In fact, news from just a minute ago, it's 10:29 p.m. and this was published at 10:28 p.m. We're not far off, but there's still no agreement. Axios News reported this, citing White House sources. The government hopes for a diplomatic breakthrough by the end of Trump's trip to China, which is scheduled for next Friday. Then they change, maybe, I don't know. If by that date no agreement has been reached, according to sources, the president might once again consider ordering military action. I don't know. It would be the 86th postponement of an attack, so by now even this thing about postponing, no. Because then if you bluff with the military threat, you can't do it forever because you completely lose credibility.
Then let's imagine, by the way, if up to now we've seen that several times when there was war, let's say, of high intensity. Months ago, we heard several times from Israeli or US sources that they basically claim to have destroyed most of the missiles, the launchers, basically the Iranian weapons. And then this didn't happen. Anyway, not at that level, so much so that today I was even reading an article from a US newspaper, which honestly I can't remember, but it was one of the major ones. It even lowered the percentage of destroyed launchers to 20% or something like that. So they were saying that actually a large part of the Iranian arsenal has been restored. But what does all this mean? That with an attack, more or less, I'm not saying a surprise attack, but still a fairly sudden attack, or at least all at once. Imagine an attack tomorrow. After all these warnings, all this time to prepare, Iran will absolutely be prepared.
There will be little left to bomb except for what you can't hide.
They will have moved everything, dispersed what could be moved, hidden things, and then put them back in place again. Iran will also have noticed, among other things, during previous attacks where it was vulnerable, where it was less vulnerable, where, for example, the Americans can fly more air sorties and where they can reach less effectively. Iran, of course, has been doing only that in these weeks. The Iranian military is preparing for the second chapter of this conflict, and it's hard to think they are less prepared than for the first.
They are also doing something else that is quite important. They are refining their targeting process. You mean now? This is for the defensive part, like how to protect themselves from the blow they might receive. The second part is how to strike where it hurts the most. Given the experiences they've gained in this month of war, what was done wrong, which type of missile could have worked better or couldn't be used, and maybe we sent 3 instead of 2. Everything that has been learned during this period and the refinement, the refining, maybe the process of identifying targets based on strategic vulnerability. So they may have refined the plan to say, okay, in your opinion, if we subject Israel to a massive attack, really in 4 days, that wipes out, I don't know, the port of Haifa, the desalination plants here, the 2 refineries they have. I mean, if we focus on these things, how long can that state hold out? How long can it last? That's what I meant. This month has been very useful for making plans that are based on real experiences, not ones gained a year ago.
Ma maturate un mese e mezzo fa.
So there's also the offensive side, not just the defensive side.
Absolutely, in a certain sense. There's often a saying that every army is ready to fight the previous war, but in this case, it's the current war. Because if they really start again at this moment, they're really ready to fight the war even better. It has basically the same characteristics as 2 months ago. And here, I think this brings us back to what we said at the start of the live stream. That is, think about the role of all that satellite intelligence that has been analyzed by the Iranians in these months. That is, in which, I mean, understanding where missile or drone attacks got through the most, for example, and where it's not even worth doing them that way. If, in fact, an anti-ballistic defense has shown, let's say, for example, that the Israeli defense has proven to be very effective, first of all, greetings to the general's cat. If the defense has proven to be very effective against certain types of medium-range missiles, maybe Iran could decide not to waste them anymore on that kind of target and use them against others. On the other hand, if a defense has proven to be very ineffective against, what do I know, the cheap ones? Suicide drones. Iran might not waste expensive missiles since they have fewer ballistic missiles, but use only suicide drones, where it's known that the enemy only has that defense. So there are all these calculations. Or another thing that comes to mind now, for example, they may have basically noticed through experience. Up to what range do we place the US carrier group? Usually the drone you send for reconnaissance gets detected and shot down at dozens of kilometers away. It gets detected and taken down. Even there, you can use this information to know how much to risk with reconnaissance and how much to stay safe. So basically, you see, there are a lot of issues.
Daniele and Giuseppe, let's see if there are the costs of this war. It's a topic in America beyond the economic crisis it's causing, but really the actual cost itself. I know because there was a hearing and so on, and Trump's team wasn't even able to provide a budget or an estimate.
Exactly. Earlier, I mentioned a figure that has definitely increased, but last week it was estimated at $25 billion just in weapons and so on. And this is a point that's also being emphasized in Washington. Capitini also mentioned it earlier. You didn't just spend a lot of money, but you also depleted your missile stockpile. Some say 40% of the United States missile stockpile, which can't be replenished in just a few months. It's a bit like what George R. Farris was saying about oil wells. It obviously takes a lot of time. The first to count how many missiles the Americans used against Iran are actually the Chinese. The more the Americans use against Iran, the fewer they'll have to protect Taiwan in the future. So that's one thing. The issue of cost is obvious because you have pressure. It's something that anyone who follows Parabellum immediately understands. You're under pressure from the American public. Not because it doesn't win in Iran, but because it increases the cost of living for someone who doesn't even know where Canada is, let alone Iran. And so the pressure from society in recent days on some of Republican lawmakers, you probably saw that in the past few days there was another meeting between Trump and them, in which he repeated what he had said in January. That is, he acknowledged it. Vote in the United States of America. We lose the House. But this morning there was a very interesting analysis in the Washington Post that says, as of today, they also risk losing the Senate, which doesn't just mean a political blow. It means someone is going to jail. I mean, we're in a situation where American society on a political level has become so bitter. Okay. Trump is trying to put the former director of the FBI, the CIA, and so on in prison. But rest assured that if the opposing side, which is currently the minority, wins, they won't forgive him anymore. I mean, he has built up a lot of resentment, especially in Washington. Washington has thousands of former Capitol colleagues, thousands of Pentagon generals, FBI and CIA officials who were fired. About 300,000 federal employees were fired last year, but especially in Washington. It's full of top executives thrown out on the street who can't wait to get their revenge. If they lose the Republican elections, and as of today, they will lose them. So you start to hear it, especially on the issue you mentioned, the costs of the war. You start to hear it, especially on some American podcasts. The point of view of the average American voter who says, excuse me, but you cut health care, but you had promised, because that's what matters to any human being. But you said that American medicines, which are expensive, shameful, let's say, shameful compared to the rest of the world. And it's not true about the cost of money, you told me. Then you dismantled what little automotive industry there was, like Tesla and so on, that was competing with the Chinese. Nowadays, it would be really convenient for me to have an electric car. You brought me back to fossil fuels, thus taking America out of the competition. Giving the Chinese a fast track, leaving the American to deal with fossil energy that costs more and more and pollutes more and more. And you say, but in exchange for what did the Trump administration do this? It's clear in recent days that the question, which was easy to predict, the closer we get to the midterms, the more the American public asks their representatives. With this whole Iran war thing, where do you want to go with it? It's obvious we haven't talked about it. But also Rubio's visit to the Pope. Be careful, because in the polls, when Trump insulted the Pope the other day, 2/3 even of the Republicans told him, you're out of your mind. Americans told him that, not just anyone. I mean, there's a deep divide in American society right now regarding the economy, but also about Trump's approach itself. Maybe you've seen that they inaugurated the first airport in Florida named after him, but it's just the first, because then what did he do? He is asking to change the name of the Dallas airport and New York's Penn Station as well. He said, if not, I won't give you federal funding. So you understand, day after day, It's the economic situation, like in every country in the world, that changes people's lives.
What, the Trump Strait too? Like, that's all we needed. The issue of ammunition is very interesting, both from a procurement point of view, because as soon as the war in Ukraine broke out and then everything went crazy, in October 2023, in the Gaza Strip, the first concern that all the think tanks were raising was that America was not able to handle two medium-intensity conflicts, and therefore to supply two fronts, which was exactly what they wanted to avoid with rapid interventions, even coalition ones. The help given to the Israelis against the Iranian attacks was precisely to say, end it here, we'll help you a couple of times, but that's it. Enough, kids, stop playing. We can't keep making these interventions forever, can we? I think this is also one of the reasons why probably the Israelis against Iran, like saying, look, you don't have to babysit us for life. Let's give them a good hard blow, knock them out, so you don't have to babysit us every time they decide to attack us. And instead, they got exactly the opposite effect. On one side, you have the Europeans setting aside money to buy American weapons to supply the Ukrainians, and now you have a conflict that has ended up consuming a large number of Tomahawks, Rams, missiles, and Patriots anyway. So exactly those two scenarios you didn't want, you ended up creating them yourself. At least that's what was being talked about in the 23rd.
Let me add something. There are 2 points that we can connect to what Giorgio Alfaras was saying. The Trump administration managed to empty the strategic reserves in just 2 months. Because one of the problems that Alfaras was explaining is that it's true that Americans also sell us energy. But it's also true that, like everything in life, if you have 100 million barrels, you can't just show up with a magic wand. If you sell more than you produce, they decrease. Same thing with ammunition. So the two things you're saying go together. And there's actually an investigation that came out this morning in the Financial Times precisely about the issue of weapons for Europeans, in the sense that when you no longer have the supplies you had promised, for example, to the Germans, it creates a problem that actually leaves Europe with a defensive gap for 3 or 4 years. At that point, a political reaction. Mirko, that is, European politicians today are, let's say, in trouble. But the reputational damage to the credibility of the United States of America, no matter how concerned Europe is, will force European politicians, Japan, South Korea, and Australia to organize themselves independently from the Americans. Even in the future, no matter who the president of the United States of America is, that's the point. This time, with this presidency, it's not like if another president comes back, things will return to some kind of normality. There's no going back anymore. The damage from shifting from being an empire to being a great power, in my opinion, has now become structural, but at best it will last for the next 20 years.
Paulo, I'll let you close since we were talking about it on the phone today as well. Is it possible that all of these wasn't the war in Ukraine enough? This crisis and also Trump's moves like the withdrawal or the threat of withdrawal, which we know they can't actually carry out for logistical, strategic, and operational reasons. But let's pretend that he's actually doing it. He's gradually forcing the politicians' hand, even in the face of the conflict in Ukraine. They had the guts to start taking steps toward creating a European force. Because we saw the first very tentative signs of a coalition force around Cyprus. Portugal has at least registered those who could become future military personnel. The same goes for Germany, so even, let's say, the introduction of the discussion about military necessity within countries, which 5 or 6 years ago was unthinkable. Even just talking about a mobilization, even just considering it, auxiliary forces or things like that.
I would propose awarding the Charlemagne Prize to Donald Trump. You know, it's the prize that recognizes those who have made significant contributions to the European Union, because what Trump managed to do to the European Union had never been done before. No one simply has taken away all security. As Daniele Moro rightly said, it's something that's been taken away and it won't be restored by the next person. It's not just a matter of waiting for the night to pass. And this especially convinced the ruling class. For a certain period, let's say for about the first half of the war in Ukraine, during the transition from Biden to Trump, the European leadership seemed to trust that, well, Trump will leave and everything will go back to normal. We go back to the dynamics, the timing, the demands we're used to. Let's say yes anyway, then we might not even have to follow through on it. Now, this attitude has clearly changed because they've realized what Daniele was saying earlier. Look, once Trump is gone, there's no going back. You stay in that mode, maybe in a more polite, calmer, maybe a little more relaxed way about this kind of relationship with the United States. The problem is that our ruling classes were not built to handle emergencies, and above all, they were not built to handle emergencies of this level. That is, we decide to divert a significant part of the state's budgets. Because let me remind you, the European Union is an interstate agreement. That's what it is. It's not a state that decides to invest in this or invest in that. So we have to ask all European states to allocate a significant part of their gross domestic product to rearmament. It's just that our ruling classes rightly have to deal with the fact that they need to be voted for again, that they have to run in elections. And this is for the internal political side. But what is especially missing is that we have no idea what to do, that something needs to be done. Everyone agrees when the next question is asked, yes, but what should we do? And then that's when we start to fall into complete chaos. Because it starts with identifying the threat, whatever that threat may be, or the set of threats that are credible for all of Europe. From its borders with the Russian Federation to its borders with the Atlantic. What are the real threats that will destabilize a Europe that is poorly protected by the United States in the next 20, 30, 40 years? That's a good question, because the answer you give to that question determines what the threats will be. Doctrines are established, meaning how threats are understood, and it's determined with what means. That is, what is the military-industrial policy that will provide Europe with the means to implement the doctrine needed to counter the threats? This is the logical process, but it's a process that still doesn't exist, which beyond just coming is like seeing a headless chicken running somewhere and not knowing what to do. We know that something needs to be done, but nobody knows what. They're kicking us in the ass, Paolo, but there's not. No, you're right. They're kicking us in the ass. That's the leadership, but it's still the ass. I mean, exactly. That's it. In the absence of a brain, you hit the only part they used to think, so they already think with that part anyway. You even kick them there. Just imagine. What a mess. The problem, however, will become very serious for us Europeans, for us citizens of the various European states, because the question that will be asked of us is, guys, let's choose someone who actually understands something, someone who can set up a process, because the time for let's see, let's do it later, we'll think about it now is over. It's no longer up to us, so we need to find someone who is able to develop the process. It's not just us talking about the French, the Germans, the English, the Spanish, and we have people available to us who can do this, who know what to do. Anyway, on the other hand, we have proof, in fact, of what it means. Do you remember when there was the commentary on Coppi, a lone man in the lead? Here, his name is Fausto Coppi. It works perfectly in cycling. He became a legend. Trump turned it into a leadership system that doesn't work because it's an extremely complex system, a superpower, or like a union of states that overall are diverse and complex like Europe. It can't work if there's just one man in charge who, in the meantime, to stay in charge, has completely decapitated that whole structure of knowledge, of skills, of memory, and also of ideas that allow a complex state to move slowly but in understandable directions. We have someone who thinks like Petrolini's emperor. Well done, thank you. They say well done even when you say nothing. That's his goal. But this system doesn't work because large masses need complex projects and certainties. Complex projects that need decades to be put into action. If you decide to walk away from the goal, it's a process that starts from Europe. It's a process that starts today and ends in 40 years. If you want to do something for yourself,
the closure. Europe is moving on the economic front. It's creating tools to manage crisis after crisis after crisis. Or do we just live day by day? Are you seeing this?
It's laying the groundwork for what could be the start of a project. Let's put it that way. I mean, they're discussing the beginning of a project. Topics that don't come out of nowhere. The Prime Minister of Canada was the one who said that the world had changed and there was no longer an empire but a superpower. Then a series of proposals came out, the famous proposals by Draghi and Letta. Let's leave it at that. The merit, however, is that these are signals, and more signals. At a certain point, people started discussing that European public debt could partially replace American debt, which is definitely in very bad shape. This brings us to finance. So there are these strong signals. But what the general said earlier is true. It takes decades from the moment you decide to do it.
It's not like that for everyone. For example, this crisis in Japan is causing a huge problem. Countries that are much more dependent.
But to go back to Europe, you have to think that, let's say, Europe has become defenseless. Because after two monstrous wars and the construction of the welfare state, you no longer have the warlike spirit. That willingness to do certain things that still exists in other countries, for example, is no longer there. In Japan, there are some cultural things. Once you have replaced militarism with the welfare state, you no longer feel like encouraging people to join the military or do anything of that kind. So there are very difficult and very complex cultural phenomena. So it's not like politicians with a magic wand suddenly decide that Europe is not only rearming itself. That one of Draghi's 3 projects, moreover, enters into high technology, the second project, and the third even becomes ecological. And believe me, so you also have to have it. Pardon the joke. It's historic. I mean, you have to be patient because these are very long historical phenomena and you need to wait. Otherwise, that's it. We're terrible. Europe is Venus, not Mars. The United States will eat later, let alone the Chinese or the Muslims. You have to be detached and know that what's happening is probably manageable over very long periods of time.
The interesting thing is that in the end, to wake up Europe, it took not only an external enemy, but also the enemy, the friend who becomes an enemy. They had to have both of them.
Let's say that up until Putin, at the beginning, he contributed, but let's say that the main character, the star,
I see. So I want to thank everyone for this evening. So Eduardo Fontana, all the sources are in the description, so go check them out if you want. There was other stuff. Daniele Moro, who managed to connect, so we made it. Giorgio Alfaraz for his economic insights, and General Paolo Capitini, who rushed home to Nepi just to make this connection, so we always manage to get things done. Anyway, see you on Sunday.
I also say hello to the little cat and the
little cat who looks at the camera. I think he's becoming a bit of a diva.
Little bit. Good night.
Good night.